Have you ever had issues with a sync problem in AD Connect? Have you ever had a user on-premise show up as two users in the cloud? One of them is synced to the user on-premise, but not the right one? Well, stick around because we're going to talk about how to resolve that. Hi everybody, this is Joe Malarkey with a Secure CRC update. So I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day, and they mentioned a problem with their AD Connect. They have a hybrid environment where they have Active Directory on-premise, and they have Office 365, obviously in the cloud with Azure Active Directory. They're copying their users from on-premise to the cloud and keeping them in sync. Now they happen to be using ADFS as the logon method, but the issue they were having happens no matter what the logon method is, password hash sync or pass-through authentication. The issue was occasionally a user would get out of sync from their on-premise account to their cloud account. A lot of times this will happen when you delete a user on-premise and then Azure AD Connect doesn't pick up the deletion for whatever reason. A lot of times you'll end up with two accounts in the cloud, and you'll see this clearly these days. One of the accounts will have a username and then a 4-digit code and then the @ symbol and their UPN suffix after that. It's an indication that somehow the user on-premise got out of sync with the user in the cloud, and the cloud thought that it should create a new user. And now the user on-premise is linked to that user with the funny name. You don't want to be linked to that user with the funny name though, because that user doesn't have anything. They didn't have a mailbox with a bunch of mail in it. They haven't been working with other things like SharePoint. And so we want really the user to be linked with the other account in Azure AD Connect, but it's not. So how do you fix that? Well, traditionally, there's been a way, if you worked with Microsoft, to modify a property of the cloud user to match it up with an anchor property back on premise. And that would fix things. Microsoft noticed, though, that lots of companies were having this issue, and so they made a little change in AD Connect a few years ago in the middle of 2017 that used a different property to keep linked between an on-premise account and the cloud account. AD Connect is the tool that actually does that. And when it copies a user from on-premise to the cloud, it has to keep those two objects in sync. It has to keep them linked together somehow. The way it does it is it uses what's called a source anchor attribute. It's just a property in Active Directory that's linked to a property in the cloud on the same user. And as long as we know the property is the same on-premise and in the cloud, we can keep those users in sync. It's how it knows which users should be connected to which users from the cloud to on-premise. Now, traditionally, this property was the object GUID. Object GUID is a unique, global unique identifier on-premise that every Active Directory object gets in Active Directory for a forest. It's a fine one to use, and Microsoft used it because it was guaranteed to be unique, which is really one of the first qualities that we need in something like this. A problem with it, though, is that the GUID, the object GUID on-premise, cannot be modified. Active Directory doesn't allow you to change that. So if a user ever gets out of sync in the cloud, meaning that property on premise, the value for it is different than the cloud value for it, then we're in trouble because we can't change that value on premise to link them back. We'd have to change the cloud one to link them back. Now in the cloud, this property is called the Immutable Id. They didn't call it whatever you call it on premise, because on premise you could use anything really for it. You didn't have to use the global unique identifier, the object GUID. You could use a different property. No matter what property you use on premise, we refer to that as the source anchor. In the cloud, if you look at a user, it's always referred to as the Immutable Id. A little bit confusing, but here's the bottom line. If you chose to use the object GUID for on-premise, then you'd look in the object GUID for a user on-premise, and you'd match that with the Immutable ID of that object in the cloud. And if they were the same, those two users were linked. So The problem here is, though, that the object GUID would not change on-premise, and so Microsoft occasionally would allow people to change it in the cloud to link those objects back. But that's not a good idea. So they changed things a few years ago to use by default a different property on-premise, a property called MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID. Now the MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID normally is empty for every user. It's just a property that's been laying around since the beginning of Active Directory, really not doing anything. Well, it's a good candidate to use as an anchor property for two reasons. Number one, it's probably not being used. Number two, we can put something into it. We can edit it. And if something goes wrong, we can change it. And that's the good part about using that instead of the object GUID. So in default installations of Azure AD Connect, the Azure AD Connect checks to see if this consistency GUID is a good match, if it will work. And really the only reason it might not choose it automatically is if any user actually has a value written into it. Then of course the tool would assume that some other application was currently using that value. Probably that's not the case, so it's going to go ahead and use it. Now you might be asking, okay, well, all of these users don't have anything in that value, in that property, so what good is it? Well, actually what AD Connect will do when it chooses to use that property is it copies the object GUID of the on-premise user into the MS-DS consistency GUID for the same user. So the object GUID and the MS-DS consistency GUID become the same value. Great. We can actually change that though on the MS-DS consistency GUID if we need to. So now we have a property that we're using to link objects on-premise and the cloud that we can actually change on-premise. So if a user ever loses its connection between on-premise and the cloud, we can go to the cloud user, we can read what the Immutable ID is, and we can simply take that and put that in as the MS-DS consistency GUID on-premise. And that will actually link those users back and they will start replicating once again. This will fix a lot of problems, including the duplicate user problem in the cloud. We pick the user we want to be linked back to the on-premise user, and we simply copy their Immutable ID from the cloud and put it into that MS-DS consistency GUID on-premise. And then those two users are connected instead of the on-premise user being connected to the wrong version of that user in the cloud. So for those of you who are using Object GUID and relying on Microsoft to allow you to change the cloud attribute, Immutable ID, they're not letting you do that anymore. They're forcing people to go to this MS-DS consistency source anchor and change it on-premise. Now, the good news is you can change this. If you're using the Object GUID as your source anchor right now, you can run the AD Connect tool again and tell it that you would like to change the source anchor. You'll notice that this is an option. So let's take a look at a demo and I'll show you exactly what I mean. Let's take a look at a typical installation. I have an Active Directory, which I will bring up here on the right. Here's Active Directory users and computers with this company called a datum. I'm not going to use a datum.com as my UPN value though. I'm going to use a different UPN suffix for this in a test environment just because I can't use a datum.com. I'll use a different one. And I'm only going to sync up the people in the IT OU. You can see there's a few of those here already. Now, I've already set up a tenant. I've already added in a custom domain, and I verified it, so I should be able to go ahead and start syncing up users. And you can see if I click on domains, I see this one right here, Lab 58. It's a crazy domain name, but that's the one that I'm using. This is my original tenant domain name that we don't really like to use, the onmicrosoft.com. This is the one that I'm going to use. Normally it would have been the name of my domain, adatum.com, but we can't use that one, so we're going to use this. So everybody's going to get an email address, or I should say UPN, which would probably be their email address as well, with this domain suffix. So I'm going to end up getting a lot more users in here. I have a few cloud accounts here already. These are just cloud-only accounts. So I'm going to switch over to my Azure AD or my Azure Active Directory tool. As a review, Azure Active Directory is Office 365's directory. I have the same users under here as I have in Office 365. If I click on Azure Active Directory and click on users, we can see then the same 4 or 5 that I had. I'm not interested in users here now though, so I'm going to go back to this Azure Active Directory, come down and choose Azure AD Connect. This is the tool that will link us up. And once it's linked up, I can come back to this tab and take a look at how it was linked up. But for now, what I have to do is download Azure AD Connect and run it. Now, I've already downloaded it, so I'm just going to come in and run it. Here it is. In fact, it looks like I've downloaded it twice. I'm going to double click on Azure AD Connect and it's going to let me install it on this computer. So Azure AD Connect makes me agree to the license. I will do that and then I'll move this up a little bit. Let me minimize everything here so I don't have anything confusing us. I'll click on continue. I'm not going to use express settings. I could. Express settings would turn on AD Connect with password hash syncing as our sign-on method, and also it would pick the immutable or the source anchor property for me. It will attempt to use MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID, but if it can't, it will use object GUID, the object GUID being the one that we really don't want. Why would it do that? Well, the only real reason it would do that is if it sees a user actually has a value already in MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID. Then it will assume that another application is using that attribute, and that will force AD Connect to automatically fall back to object GUID. So I'm going to click on Customize so I can choose what it uses. I'm going to click on Install. It's going to look through a couple things. Eventually, it should ask me to log on again. All right, so you can see it chooses password hash synchronization. I'm good with that. I'll stick with that. I'll click on Next. It's going to make me log in. I have a user here that I'm using. This is the UPN I'm going to use for everybody, this weird one here. You can see the O365 ready. Just keep that in the back of your mind. All right, I have to add a directory, an on-premise directory. So I'm going to have to log on as an existing account, which I will do. I'll click on Next. So it gives me a little bit of a hassle here about not verifying and adding my original domain of datum. I can't because that's in use from Microsoft. So I'm not going to verify that. I'm going to stick with this one, the O365 Ready one. I have all my users using that one on premise. I'm all good to go. So I'm just going to tell it, ignore that a datum one. I'm not using it. Not a normal thing that you will do for most companies, but I'm going to do that in this case. Now it's going to ask me who all is getting synced. Well, I don't want to sync the whole company. I'm just going to sync the IT OU. So I'm going to choose IT. I can sync everyone else later. Maybe I'm just doing a pilot. Here's the important part. Two things here, uniquely identifying your users. How are they going to log on and what represents them in their logon name? Well, the top part here we'll leave alone. Users are represented only once. This, however, might not be the case. You might have one forest where you have users, another forest where you have, for instance, an Exchange installation. So the users in the user forest are linked to the Exchange mailbox in the Exchange forest, in which case that user is actually in both forests. We have two different representations of them. So if we had something like that, we'd have to tell it, but we don't. So let's ignore that. The bottom part is the part that I want us to pay attention to. Let Azure manage the source anchor. This is a property on premise that will become the immutable property in the cloud, the Immutable Id. Normally it will try and choose MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID. In fact, if I tell it that I want to choose, it defaults to that. But I am going to tell it specifically to use the old school method, object GUID, the one we really don't want, but again, I want to show you how to switch it in the future. So I'm not going to filter out any users any more than I already have. I'm going to keep the defaults here and just get this done. It's going to start a synchronization when I click on install. So it'll set it up. It's using the object GUID on premise, and it's going to translate that into an immutable ID in the cloud. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to use it for a user named Ida here. Ida is going to be one of the users getting synced. Let's double click on this person, go to Attribute Editor, and find Object GUID. Here it is. You can see it starts out 4857D5. Now, we can take that GUID number and we can put it into hexadecimal, or we can put it into a binary, a couple of different formats. The weird thing is that you will have to eventually do that if you need to synchronize or resynchronize a user, because in the cloud, that number gets put into Immutable Id format, which is a different format than this GUID format, which is also a different format than hexadecimal format. Fortunately, there are ways to translate it. I'll show you a script that we'll use for that in just a little bit, and how to get that script. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit and find another attribute called MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID. Here it is. You can see there's nothing in there. In fact, there isn't anything in there for anyone right now. There will be, though, when we switch over to use it. All right, looks like my configuration is complete. It's telling me it's a good idea to enable Active Directory Recycle Bin. It is, actually, because of what I'm talking about. One of the issues that we run into is when you delete a user on premise, if you were to try and recreate the user, it would be a brand new user. You would end up getting 2 users in Azure Active Directory because of that. And the Active Directory Recycle Bin keeps the user around for the tombstone lifetime, all of its properties as well. So that's always a good thing to turn on. Let me click on Exit here. So now everything is working and things are getting synced to the cloud. So I'm going to take a look at some users here. I'll do it through the PowerShell and also through my Office 365 Admin Center. Let's start here and take a look at our users. I only had, I think, 4 users before. Now you can see I got a lot of users, and they all have this lab, whatever, 0365 domain name. So I have a lot more users here in the cloud. Great. One of them, in fact, is Ida. There she is. Well, let's take a look at Ida. I've already installed the MS Online Azure Active Directory module. I've installed an Azure AD Connect Sync module. I'm going to come in and find Ida's name here. Here's a get MSOL user for Ida. I'm piping into a format list. I want to see the user principal name, the immutable ID, and even an office property. I do that because I'm going to change the office so you can see that it actually changes here. See this immutable ID? That is that GUID that we saw before. It's just in a different format. I will show you how to put that in correct format in just a little bit. So let's go back to Active Directory on-premise. So here's my on-premise Ida. I can look at her or him through PowerShell as well. But let's take a look at this office, New York. Let's change it to Chicago. I'll click on OK. The next time things get synced, that should change in the cloud. It doesn't change right away, though. I'll see it's still New York. I have to wait for the sync to happen. Well, I'm impatient, so I'm going to start the sync myself. There's a command called start AD sync cycle. It's part of the AD sync module that I've installed. It takes a parameter called policy type. Policy type will usually be delta, but it could also be initial, which you can probably figure out does everybody, but delta just does the changes. I can watch these changes happening if I get into the AD Connect synchronization service. So I'm a little late, but I see that it was a success that happened at 10:15. You can see it, that was just a few seconds ago. So it was successful. I see there was an update here. If I click on it and I click on this update, I'll see New York and Chicago. So I can see that it made a change. Let's go double check. So before, when I did that get MSOL user, I saw New York. I'm going to use that command again, and now I see Chicago. So the change happened. So these two are in sync. Now what I'm going to do is run a script Let me scroll down a little bit to show you this immutable ID and the different translations of it. I have a script on my hard drive which I got from a gentleman whose name I will show you because I forgot what it was. Here he is, Nicholas Umlin. I'll put this blog entry in the notes in the more section on this video, so you'll be able to get to it later, but there it is, blog.jumlin.com. You can find this script called Translate Immutable ID. Well, I'm going to run this script. I have it right, I have my PowerShell open. So I'm going to run the script, and it's going to ask me for a value. I want to put this P9V value. I'm going to put that in there. So I'll just do it the old-fashioned way. I'll copy it. I'll use this mark, highlight it, hit Enter to copy it. I'll right-click down here and paste it in there. Great. Now I hit Enter, and look at the translations I got. Hexadecimal and GUID. Notice the GUID, 4857, small d. Well, let's go back and take a look at IDA's on-premise account. We were just looking at this under Attribute Editor, under Object GUID. You can probably see it, 4857d. It's the same. So this value I have for Immutable ID is the user's GUID. It's just in a different format. Now, when we switch over to use MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID, it's going to use yet a different format. It's going to use hexadecimal. So we'll actually see it in here as this, 3FD557. We haven't done that yet, though. So when might we end up having to do that? Well, once again, sometimes the online user gets out of sync with the on-premise user. A lot of times this happens when we delete a user on-premise, create another one, or for whatever reason we have a delete and AD Connect doesn't pick the delete up. We end up with an extra user online. Sometimes that user will have the regular username followed by 4 digits and then the @ sign. And if you're watching this video, you very well may have had that situation. The on-premise user will be linked to the goofy user with the 4 digits. We don't want that though, because that's a brand new user. You want the old user to be linked with your on-premise account. That's what we're going to go over now, how to get that linked. All right, so let's go back to my users here. There's IDA. Let's say that this IDA and my on-premise IDA somehow got out of sync. And now I have to fix it. Well, in order to fix it, I'm going to have to switch the immutable ID, the source anchor, to use something different. How do I do that? Well, I have to run AD Connect. I'm going to click, I'm going to go back into my Azure AD Connect. Same tool I just ran, only I'm going to run it again. Let me minimize everything again so we can focus on this tool. I'll click on Configure, and I have several tasks. One of which is just to view the current configuration. So I'll click on that, click on Next, and I can see my source anchor here is Object GUID. I want to change that. So I'm going to click on Previous. My option to change that is right here, Configure Source Anchor. You'll usually only see this if your current source anchor is set to Object GUID. So I'm going to click on that and click on Next. I'm going to have to log in again, which I will do. It's going to recommend that I actually use the MS-DS consistency. And you can see here that I'm using Object GUID. Upgrading the MS-DS consistency GUID is strongly recommended as a best practice, as it allows easy recovery of accidentally deleted on-premise users. Well, yes, it really what it allows us to do is edit that value on-premise to match the immutable ID of a user in the cloud, thereby linking them again. That's what it allows. And yes, the normal issue that most companies have is with deleted and recreated users. So let me click on Next. So it's going to do that. It's going to start a synchronization after I click on Configure. So 2 things are going to happen. Number 1, it's actually going to take the Object GUID for all of my on-premise users, and it's going to copy that to the MS-DS consistency GUID for all my on-premise users. It's just going to copy it right over, and I can actually see that if I get back into Azure Active Directory. Here's IDA. Let's take a look at IDA's attribute editor. The Object GUID is still there. Of course, it never changes. But let's take a look at the MS-DS consistency value. consistency GUID. It was empty before. We can see there's something in there. If I double click, we can see it's a big hexadecimal string. And those of you with good memories might remember the first few numbers here. 3FD5, that was actually a translation of that immutable ID, which was a translation of the object GUID. They're all the same number. In fact, let's go back to my online user and take a look. Sure enough, 3FD557, that's the hex. That is the same number. All of these are the same number. What happens if, for some reason, the immutable ID gets changed or we get a new IDA and things get out of sync? Well, in order to demonstrate that, what I'll do is actually purposely screw up the MS-DS consistency value. So I'm actually going to do this on IDA. I'll have to do that. I'm not going to do it with Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to do it with a different tool, Adsi Edit, which allows me to change many things. So here's IDA. I'll get into the properties of IDA, and I'll find that attribute again. MS-DS Consistency GUID. So right now it starts with a 3F. Let's just screw that up by making it a 3E. This is not normally the way that accounts would get out of sync, but it's going to provide us with the proper technique anyway. Really, all I want to do is get the user in the cloud back synced up with a user on premise. So what I'm going to do now that I've changed that, I'm going to start a sync cycle again. It's going to have issues. I could actually see those issues. But we're not really interested with that. We're interested in the fact that these two users are no longer in sync. So let's go back into IDA now, and I'm going to change. Let's see here. I didn't click on OK, so I might have to start that again. Oops. So we'll start it again. Now I'm going to come back to IDA, and I'm going to change Chicago into something different. Let's pick, how about LA? I'll click on OK. So now, before when I did another sync cycle, eventually it picked that change up and it changed it to LA. So if I do this again and hit enter, it should do that, but it's not going to because these two accounts are now not the same account according to AD Connect. AD Connect does not have them synced. They are two separate accounts because the source anchor on premise, MS-DS Consistency GUID, and the immutable ID in the cloud now have different values. So let's wait a little while, and I'll see that. I'll take a look at the get MSOL user. It should have had enough time to change. And it did change. So we'll start the AD sync cycle command again, wait a little bit, and sooner or later it should have had time to make that change to IDA. But you notice it's still Chicago, and we could wait forever here and it will still say Chicago because these are not the same users anymore. So these users are out of whack. How do we fix that? Well, you fix it by finding the immutable ID here in the cloud and translating that into the MS-DS consistency GUID for back on premise. Once again, the way we would do that is to find the immutable ID, and here I'm using get MSOL user from my user, and one of the properties I'm looking at is immutable ID. Then I would use that script that I ran before, translate immutable ID, and I would paste this immutable ID in here to get the hexadecimal value. So let me do a copy here once again, do a paste. This hexadecimal value is what I need to be placed into the MS-DS consistency GUID on premise. So I would just type that in. So let's go back there, and if you remember, I just changed it a little bit. So if I get into the properties of my on-premise IDA and find MS-DS consistency GUID, I changed this initial 3F to a 3E. Let's just change it back to a 3F. But you can imagine we could just put the whole value in here. I'll click on OK, click on OK. Things are now fixed, believe it or not. Let's do another sync cycle. May take a little while to get that done, but after it gets synced, I'm going to see that this problem is fixed and the Chicago should change to an LA. So let's go back here to my sync service. I see there's still a delta synchronization in progress. Well, it was in progress. Looks like it got updated. Here's an update. Let's take a look at that. There I see Chicago and LA. So we can pretty much tell that it's fixed. Let's go take a look at it from the command line though. Let me scroll down just a little bit here and run the get MSOL user again. And sure enough, the office is back to LA. Not only that, but everything else is synced, including the user's password. Well, that'll just about do it, everybody. Thanks a lot for sticking around. I hope that clears up what the source anchor is, as well as a good reason to go to the new source anchor, the MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID, in your current installations. Remember, though, if you do change the source anchor from Object GUID to the MS-DS-ConsistencyGUID on your AD Connect, make sure that you change it on all of the servers that you're running AD Connect on. It's a server-specific setting. So once you set it on the main server, go to the standby server, the staging servers, and change it on those as well. Thanks for hanging around for this Secure CRC update. I'm Joe Malarkey. We'll see you next time.